Absolutely.
Live right now.
Welcome everyone to the 2023 Civic Engagement and Leadership Development Sessions, The Battle for Democracy. My name is Alethea Jones, and I am Distinguished Lecturer in Labor Studies and Director of CELD. Today, you're joining us for our last session in our 2023 series, and we close with the battle for democracy in Michigan. Michigan is a place of many, many gifts, not the least of which is Motown, of course. Politically, it is the site of, in my mind, the most active, one of the most active chapters of the abolitionist movement, being that Detroit is located just over the bridge from Canada. And so it's always represented for me a site of freedom. It's also a site of strong unions, an incredibly rich union history tied to the auto industry. And so the fight for dignity, for bread and roses is very much a part of what Michigan represents. I know I'm overly focused on Detroit, and I hope we'll learn more about Michigan beyond Detroit. Detroit certainly holds a special place for me. It's also the site of deindustrialization and extreme urban segregation, and the Flint water crisis certainly comes to mind. And I think in those things, it means that Michigan has been a precursor to many political developments that affect us across the country. And last week, when we featured Georgia, the saying, as the South goes, so goes the nation, we may need to do a slight revision and to say, as Michigan goes, so goes the nation, given that Michigan was actually the site of the first attempted coup, the precursor, some might say the dress rehearsal, to the January 26, 2021 attempted coup. Today, we're so pleased to welcome Art Reyes, Executive Director of We the People Michigan, and Jennifer Root, Executive Director of SEIU Michigan, to discuss the past, present, and future of politics in Michigan and this nation as we battle for real, authentic, multiracial democracy in this nation, and dare I say, across the world. Welcome. Let's start with just getting to know you both a bit. We're curious about your current role, and if you could describe your organization's place in Michigan's electoral and social justice ecosystem. Art, we could start with you.
Great, sounds good. Good morning, folks. Really great to be on with all of you. And Dr. Jones, thanks so much for the invitation. Very excited to be part of this conversation series and following some good friends from Georgia and New York on these calls. So it's really great to see part of the series. My name is Art Reyes. I use he and him. I'm the executive director of an organization called We the People Michigan. And we work to build multiracial working class community organizing infrastructure across the state of Michigan. The way that we see our work is really grappling with the central question: is it possible in a place like Michigan to build legitimate multiracial working class organizing power that can really work to build proactive vision of the type of state and communities we deserve and can test over time for governing power to see that through? That is something that we view our work very deeply rooted in long haul work, and it is something that we know we have to be incredibly thoughtful about inside outside game, about how we're building legitimate base to be fighting over the long haul, and how we see the elections as one important tool, not the thing, not the tool, which often in a place like Michigan that is of electoral importance nationally, folks can see it as just an election battleground. So for us, it's really important that we see it as one tool for advancing our broader work. I can stop there and happy to come back a little bit more for some of the personal introduction, but you're asking for organization right now. So I'll stop there and kick it over to my comrade, Jen.
Thanks, Art. I will echo the thank you for having us. I'm always excited to talk about Michigan. It is a place I have loved. I'm born in Indiana, but my family's also from Michigan, so I spent much of my life in Michigan. I am the executive director for SEIU Michigan, which is where our 4 SEIU local unions here in Michigan come together to build power. I've been in the SEIU world for over a decade and worked with workers in all different sectors. And what brought me back to Michigan was, the attacks on working people in the place where the middle class was born. And what I would say is, our work is, yes, to lift up our existing members, but we have a very aggressive agenda around unions for all. We believe that no matter where you work or what type of work you do, no matter who you do it for, you should have the right to form a union. And we are also really explicit at naming the attacks on working people have disproportionately impacted women and disproportionately impacted women of color. And that's not an accident, that's been an intentional choice by a lot of lawmakers for a lot of decades. And so how do we attack a system born in white supremacy to lift up all workers? And so that's really the work we do and what we center. We have a very diverse membership, from nursing home workers to corrections officers to the people who paint the Mackinac Bridge, to unemployment operators who give benefits to Michiganders who need them. So just all over the place. And we believe, again, our agenda is really lifting up that the system is broken and we have to rewrite the rules to make sure they center workers.
Thank you for helping us, who are mostly New Yorkers, understand and locate your organizations and what they do. So tell us a little bit about yourselves and share with us your first substantive introduction to the world of politics, the introduction that had you have that aha moment, like, yeah, this is a game I want to play for life.
Do you want to start, Jen, this one? Okay.
Sure. So I will say this will age me, and so forgive me that. But I remember the 1988 presidential election very vividly. My mother's union, had endorsed Mike Dukakis, and I felt like Mike Dukakis was going to be our president. I was had many arguments with my mother, who didn't feel like I was old enough to phone bank. I could only tally at the phone bank. She didn't think I could be on the phones. I wasn't old enough, she said. And I remember vividly on the day after the election saying, if only you'd let me phone bank, Mike Dukakis would be our president right now. And so for me, it was a tragic loss. And I took it very personally because I really felt like, had I done that work in Indiana at the time, and my mother's Teamsters Halls, so Mike Dukakis would have won, which naivety of the young. But what I will say is that election Indiana gave the gift of Dan Quayle to this country, but that opened his Senate seat, which was taken by my member of Congress. And then there was a special election for Congress. We were able to elect Jill Long Thompson to that seat. So folks may not remember her. She was the first woman to represent that area of Michigan, or that area of Indiana, ever. And I was able to phone bank for her again. My mother had learned her lesson. So I was able to phone bank for Jill Long Thompson. And for me, it was a huge lesson in kind of keeping in persistence and keeping at it. And that representation matters. As a little girl, to have a woman represent me in Congress was incredibly new and felt really profound. And so for me, again, the lessons in persistence and maybe letting children phone bank, but also, that representation really matters, and that it meant something to me to have her in Congress and to have helped make that happen in a very, very small way. So that was my first introduction to politics.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I hadn't heard that story before. So, I think for me, in a little bit of a way, I was kind of, I was raised in it a bit, but so I grew up in Flint, Michigan, that's home. My family came to Flint in the 1940s and 50s as migrant workers from South Texas, who came up mostly working in the fields, working on the migrant trail. Michigan is also a big agriculture state. We have a lot of farm workers. So that's how my family kind of first wound up here. But it was also in the era that UAW had some massive victories, the Flint sit-down strike, which I was deeply steeped in as a as a kid that had won in 1937, and really General Motors started in Flint. It had since moved its headquarters to Detroit, but it started in Flint. So my family came for the auto jobs. So everybody hired into the factories, and I think for my family, Flint represented this type of beacon of hope for working class people. This was not, I wasn't told of this kind of in a mythologized American dream way, but rather it was a story of worker struggle. It was a story of people who said, like, we need to make claims on power. And so for me, kind of growing up in Flint, there was a lot of kind of moments that were kind of shaping the way that I saw the world. I think one was my family had this sense of what Flint was, of this kind of beacon of hope for working class people, where they'd gotten union jobs and were able to have stability. But when I was growing up, I was where my parents were in high school, and it was the beginning of the wave of layoffs and then plant closures, and that stability that my family had for a couple of decades really disintegrating pretty quickly. So Flint actually went from the highest per capita income city in the United States in the 1950s for a very brief period after a big contract victory to the poorest city in the United States today. So I was kind of growing up on that trajectory as a lot of things were really spiraling in Flint. And so for me, it was watching a lot of my family and community lose work, plants shut down, and my family very quickly lose the stability that they had had now for a couple of decades, and folks out of work, kind of scattering, moving away, slipping, back into poverty and losing the stability they'd had with union jobs for a period. And so for me, there's a lot of those moments that I think were really present, but I'll just share two kind of quick examples. One is, my dad hired in to what was at the time called AC Spark Plug, one of the plants, when I was about 5 is when he hired in. And my dad, like the rest of my family, very active in their local unions. I was a union hall rat. I was always everywhere with my dad. So I was always posted up at UAW Local 651. And the mostly it was retirees that were kind of always hanging out the hall, giving me random shit to do, to like sweep or make coffee with like massive jugs of Folgers and this like gigantic percolator. But I was always also hearing all these stories. My dad's local for a UAW local was unique because it was the old spark plug plant. My grandmother used to work there. For a period, most of the workers were women in these particular facilities. So the retirees that I was interacting with were mostly women that were retired. Some of them had been part of the Women's Emergency Brigade during the Flint sit-down strike, that saw themselves as the militant vanguard who were putting their bodies and lives on the line between police, between kind of company security goons and the workers who had occupied the plants. And they were very clear about their agency. And so they would say things explicitly to me, like, the only reason you got shit, the only reason you got a roof over your head and food on the table is because we brought down the most powerful corporation in the world to its knees at the time to demand dignity in the workplace. So for them, that was very clear. And I grew up with a sense of like, the reason I am okay is because like people like me, like my family, workers, said like, we don't have to put up with bullshit. And like, we actually can, even in the face of immense power, stand up together. So I was seeing that constantly. It was tumultuous when I was growing up because it was a very, very, very rough period for the UAW and for Flint in particular, as we faced plant closure after plant closure after plant closure. So a lot of my childhood was on picket lines. And the last quick story that I'll share was when I was in 6th grade. The plant that my dad worked at was on a strike, and for me it was devastating because we didn't have any fucking money. Like they're getting $100 from the strike fund and was going into school shopping, and we had moved to a trailer park in the suburbs so I could go to those schools, and I had so much anxiety of being like outed as like a poor kid, so he was like, look, we're not gonna be to school shopping. He was sitting us at the table, but I remember him telling us like, there are times we got to sacrifice to fight for what we believe in. This is one of those times. And me and my siblings, I'm the oldest of 4, were on the picket line every day with my pops that summer, and seeing. I grew up in a UAW household, so solidarity was thrown around a lot, but this is the first time I understood what that meant, of like people showing up, community showing up, people on the picket line, the songs, the chants, people bringing food, all of that, and seeing that actually we could be we could be strong. Individually, we might be weak, but collectively, we could be very strong. So I think in a lot of ways, those are some of the moments that really shaped my political outlook from a pretty young age, growing up in a pretty tumultuous time for the labor movement and for our community in Flint.
It's really striking how, for both of you, it was before you were teenagers, right? Usually there's a sense of, oh, when folks are teenagers in high school, they'll become politically active. But really appreciate the image, Jennifer, of you pestered your mom to be on the phone, right? And being in the campaign office. And I love that description of you, Art, as a union hall rat. I can see it now. Just hanging out, making the coffee and absorbing all that love and wisdom and shaping you both today. So we're going to turn to some hot topics, burning questions of what's happening in Michigan. And we want to cover both the news that gives us pause, say what the hell, as well as the good news that we may not know about, but should. Can we start with the attack on the Michigan State Capitol? That strikes me as the most glaring and daring attack on democracy, and the plans to kidnap the governor, right, at that time. So if you could just remind us about the details of that and what unfolded and what that signified for you, how your organization responded, and what you think was right and what you think still remains to be done, and how the rest of the country responded.
I want to start, or do you want to start on this one, Jen? Okay. I mean, this is a very vivid moment and day for me. So I want to paint the picture with a little bit of a split screen for folks, because this was April 30th, 2020. So at this point, right, Michigan is taking aggressive measures. It's the very early stage of the pandemic. The pandemic moves through and hits Detroit and Flint incredibly hard. Particularly a lot of our elders, especially Black and Brown folks, just get like it was awful. I lost 13 elders who were important to me in my life in a span of 2 months. Like in this period, like COVID was cutting through horrendously. With all this stuff that's happening across the state, things are getting shut down, and it's immediately in a state like Michigan, if it's segregated as Michigan, racialized. COVID's a Detroit Flint problem. COVID is not a Michigan thing. So there's a lot of this and a lot of right-wing stoking of that, the central fault line in the state that I'll come back to kind of throughout. But so there's a lot of kind of right-wing whooping up of a bunch of this stuff, and there's seizing moments on that is fueled and fanned by a lot of the kind of conservative corporate infrastructure and some Republican Party establishment kind of operators that is fueling. So they do a few things before that day. They had done like a Operation Gridlock, where they had a bunch of folks kind of come and just slow down Lansing, and so they're using kind of a right-wing populist message to do this. But we're counter-organizing, right? So for us is like we're seeing this cut through our communities. Mutual aid work starts popping up like all over the place. We're seeing really hard but really beautiful and remarkable work that's happening. And some of our, because we do both urban and rural organizing, and some of our rural communities, we had a nurse who was organizing people in her community who had RVs to donate them to hospital workers. So they're basically making a makeshift RV park so that folks weren't having to go home and risk getting their kids sick. Like there's all kinds of remarkable organizing that's happening. Mutual aid stuff popping up, people supporting each other. We were doing a big thing because undocumented people are being completely cut out of all the benefits. So we're actually in the middle of a week of action. It's a digital week of action. We're trying to be really thoughtful about, we're learning all kinds of new stuff. Like, how do we do this shit digitally? We can't be doing the big in-person rallies and things at that time. The right certainly was. So we have a digital week of action. That week in the peak is an 8-hour long action. We actually learned the idea. I learned it from a friend of mine in the labor movement in Australia, who had just done a big labor action that they had done an 8-hour long action where they had different unions take big chunks of it. And we debriefed it And I brought it to the committee. It was a big coalition of organizations. I brought it to the committee and said, like, what do we think about this? So we decided to do a thing that we called the People's Telethon. It was 8 hours long. It was on Zoom. 22,000 people chimed in over the course of the day on this Zoom. And this is a split screen I want to draw you. On one side, it was like a few dozen like armed white nationalists storming our state capitol, long rifles looming over our elected representatives in the Senate gallery. And on that same day, an equally foreshadowing gathering was happening via Zoom, different than that, but it was people from every corner of the state, Black, white, brown, Native, immigrant, Muslim, Christian, all over the place. People were coming together to do this People's Telethon, and people were craving space for community. So we dug in, and we had Black and brown folks in Detroit sharing like poetry and mourning loved ones that they had lost in that early wave. We had like white and Native folks in rural communities talking about the mutual aid that they were doing. We had undocumented people who were talking about like the need for resources where they were getting left out of the state's response. We're having some of our friends who were formerly incarcerated talk about like the pushes for us to push the governor to release more people from state facilities, like loved ones that were in harm's way. So all these things that are happening, and we're winning on a bunch of shit here, right? We're like the governor is taking aggressive executive action. We're pushing the governor to go further. We're winning on shit like a moratorium on water shutoffs, a moratorium on evictions, like all of these things. And this is our culminating event. And in the middle of it, we start getting all these texts like there's people with guns like storming the Capitol. So the thing that I want to share is like the one was violent racist backlash that we're seeing that caught the attention of the nation and in some cases globally. These images of like people decked out in fucking paramilitary gear in our state capitol. But the other side of that was the winning side. It was actually this set of like multiracial working class people having each other's backs, fighting for the future. And the reason why that's really important to draw that foreshadow is because it with only the one side of the story being, it was a foreshadow, but it's the losing side. It is because like for us, what we have seen is that if we are serious about doing the legitimate multiracial working class organizing, people showing up and having each other's back, that actually allows us to counter that in a much more powerful way. That's a small fearful group who was flailing. And in Michigan, that's what they're fucking doing right now. They're flailing, they're losing big. Because for us, that moment was like built trust, our people having each other's backs, that then led to all immediately after then it was pivoting to like us pouring out people in the streets after the murder of George Floyd in rural communities and in cities, people taking consistent action and us having each other's back. It was then spinning into the operation to defend democracy when there was a very real and scary attempt to subvert the results of the election, including political violence in Michigan in 2020 that Jen and I were part of the core team anchoring together. So that enabled all of those fights. I think it's just an important, the split screen on that is an important one, because the reality is that one, as scary as it is and as fucked up as it was, and as the kind of white nationalist fascism that we see rising, it's losing here in Michigan. And it's the only reason it's losing is not because of a charismatic governor or Democratic Party fundraising offer. It's because people in working class folks, everyday folks, and organizers are saying, we're not going to put up with this shit here, and are putting in the work. Now, for years, during the dark days when shit was very hard here, putting in the steady, slow work of building the relationships and the strategy to reshape the landscape. And right now, it's looking good. I mean, I'll kick it over to Jen because like we had a big ass victory last night here in Michigan. That was a momentous one.
Yeah, and I know we're going to get to that. I would just say echo everything Art said. And what that day meant to me, when you walk into Michigan's Capitol, which is different from any Capitol I've ever walked into, there are big signs that say no signs allowed. Like you're not allowed to bring a protest sign in, but you can bring a gun of any size, shape, right? You can bring a gun, but you can't bring a sign of protest that says anything, right? There are signs that warn you of that, but they don't warn you that there could be, armed white nationalists in the building, right? So, and I will say, a lot of the work Art talks about is resulting in the fact that we're about to change that too, right? We're about to say you can have guns in the Capitol, especially with the intent to intimidate legislators. I also, and so for me, like, that's about rewriting the rules. Like, we fundamentally have to rewrite the rules in Michigan to reflect our people's interests and to build power for our folks. Because right now the rules are rigged against them in every possible way. And I would also say, you talked about the quote unquote kidnap attempt on our governor. But I would say we have to call that what it was. It was an assassination attempt. They weren't going to kidnap her and put her in a warm room and then get ransom and bring her back safely. They were going to kill her because of the things she had done to make Michiganders safe and healthy and the policy choices she was going to make. And I just want to like name that. In addition to the deep racism, I will also say we have to name misogyny. Like, she was that woman from Michigan. Like, there's a lot of what happened that day that was about aggressive masculinity, saying this woman's not going to tell us what to do, right? And so fundamentally, like, through our work, both with the Fight Back space and in other works, like, I think we have to name, like, when we see things like misogyny, we have to name them. The attack on our election in 2020 was an attack on Black voters and Black power, full stop. Right? They didn't come to my county where I live farther away from Metro Detroit and try to attack the votes. They came intentionally to Detroit. The inference was very clear. Black folks can't count their own votes. Their votes don't matter. It was a clear attack. And so we have to name that. I think part of the work Art and I have done together, I think, is really being explicit about that. Like, you have to name things when you see them, and we have to force uncomfortable conversations. We push back against what we call Michigan nice, right? Everyone wants to be really nice and kind, but we've got to have those difficult conversations. And, we can certainly do it over a casserole. We can keep our culture, but we've got to like have those difficult conversations. And so, that's, for me, it's like naming those things when they happen, and making sure that we, to Art's point, not allow a divide and conquer. We see like a lot of divide and conquer tactics, both by our opponents on the far right and the racist white nationalists who continue to, be floundering a bit right now because they see their power diminishing. But candidly, also within our quote unquote progressive or democratic communities, like we have to like have solidarity in those spaces too. And I don't know if you want to go to the recent victory that Art talked about, but there's certainly some inside of that, some solidarity. I guess go there. So as folks may or may not have seen, I'm not sure. Yesterday, the governor signed 3 bills which repeal the so-called right to work here in the great state of Michigan for all workers, and a bill that restores prevailing wage for state partners. These are huge, huge victories. Again, what I will say is we have to rewrite the rules. And as I have said to both the governor and legislators, like, this is the floor, right? This is the first step. There are a lot more things we have to do because the attacks have been just so invasive with respect to working people. But a side note, as part of that process, having won these Democratic majorities, which, let me just say, our people have been working for decades. We finally got legitimately nonpartisan lines drawing that have allowed those majorities in some ways, but this is decades in the making. This was not one election, right? And it's going to be many more elections to keep it, expand it, and that kind of thing. This wasn't an overnight, random occurrence. This was a lot of decades and decades of work with my members, Arts, like all of our people across the state, like coming together to do that. But during this conversation, I had a legislator come up to me and say, well, prevailing wage isn't really your thing, is it? Like, that doesn't impact your workers. And I literally, in that moment, called over a brother from the electric workers union. I said, I want him to hear me tell you that, yes, prevailing wage is my thing, right? You're right. It doesn't impact my members, but it is the right thing. And it is the floor of our expectations of you. If you think this was hard, this is nothing. I want to restore organizing rights to so many workers in this state. And so many other big and bold things. So I would say right to work is huge. It finally begins to chip away at the corporate power that has kept workers in this state down. Art mentions the Flint sit-down strike. For many of us, that is, a part of our lore and our part of our history. Michigan built the middle class for this country, and we can do it again, and we should do it again. I am someone like Art who was also a union rat, but growing up, I went to the doctor when I needed to. My parents could take a day off. We weren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. Vacations were in Ohio, but there were still vacations, right? And so, that doesn't exist for workers today in meaningful way. My mother is now retired on her Teamsters pension. God bless. She can comfortably retire. Retirement security is a fiction. for most workers today. And so we have a lot of work to do. Right to work is huge, and I am celebrating it, and it makes my heart happy. But it is the floor. Like, we have so much more work to do here in Michigan.
So much to celebrate coming out of Michigan and sharing the good news with all of us. And let's dig into the decades in the making that you both referred to. And just take us back a bit. I want us to talk about infrastructure and strategy. And, you know, this series is very much informed by the new book, the recent book, Power Concedes Nothing, How Grassroots Organizing Wins Elections. And Art, I know you have a chapter in that book. And that project really tells the story of the last 10 years of progressives really putting skin in the game, in the electoral game, in a way that they haven't had before, and how that's paying off results. So for those of our attendees who are interested, we really encourage you to buy that book. But take us through what works in Michigan, and why does it work? How is the ecosystem different today than it was 10 or even 20 years ago?
Yeah.
Jennifer, why don't you start?
Oh, sure. What I will say is, I'll just from the SEIU Michigan lens, I'll say, like, one of the huge lessons we have learned, to Art's point, like, our people are not going to win because of a characteristic politician, whoever he or she may be. So we have been, since 2017, talking to both our members and voters around issues and motivating, like, figuring out what matters to them, and using that as a tool to move folks in politics. Elections are moments in our movement, and they are important, but they are, as Art said, a tool on our journey. They are not an end. I always use the example, I have protested every president since George Bush, including the ones I voted for. And because, so even electing our folks is not going to, we still have to push them to do more. I just gave an example of that on prevailing wage and right to work, wanting to divide and conquer. I've got folks saying, do you want this for nursing home workers, or do you want this for home care workers? I want both. I want, like not negotiating with ourselves. So there's a lot to do. I would say, and Art can go more into this. I think, one fundamental difference between now and 2 years ago is genuine organizing. Like, sometimes I hear a candidate or someone talk about, I have an organizer. No, you have a staffer who's canvassing, like, which is different than organizing, right? A tactic that has a purpose, but it is fundamentally different than organizing, which is about building power and helping folks unleash their own power and make changes in their lives and in their communities, right? So I think that's a fundamental change, like, that there are groups like Arts and ours who are really fundamentally shifting how we think about organizing. Like, for us, organizing is not just in the job site and politics. Those are linked. We do politics in hopes of organizing more workers into building power, right? Politics, again, a tool for us, not an end, right? And then the other thing I think that has shifted in the last 10 years are the ballot initiatives that have been used to really dramatically open the doors to our democracy to more people, right? We would not have gotten where we are today without Democratic, nonpartisan lines, which again created some fairness. I will say, still flaws in that process. It decimated the Black Caucus, for example. Like, Detroit was treated like a pie, and just a little bit of the pieces given to all these districts to make Democratic majorities. But we've seen the representation of Black elected officials in our legislature dramatically increase. How are we building a succession plan that changes that, right? So that's part of our work. But also, we have 2 ballot initiatives now centered around democracy, which have opened ballot access and made it much easier to vote, more convenient. And we have a Secretary of State who is a bold and fierce champion of that. And all of those things have made a difference, I would say, from an infrastructure perspective. But I think a lot of the differences have been with groups like Art, who've done a ton of groups. So I'll kick it to you, Art. I just feel like that's one of the fundamental difference is organizations like We the People, Michigan.
Oh, thanks, Jen. And yeah, the ton of resonance with all the things that you listed, for sure. I think for me, just to kind of like zoom out a little bit, I think when we think about like the difference between 10 years ago, which is there's contestation over this still, but what I would say is, like, the predominant mindset of I mean, Georgia is now facing a bunch of these things. They weren't as much 10 years ago, but I just heard from Ense last week, but other states, Arizona, Colorado to some extent, Florida used to, Ohio used to, Virginia, like there's these so-called target states, right, that are Wisconsin, perennially important in national elections. And I think from my perspective, 10 years ago, 10 years ago, I'd actually left. I led a different statewide organization. I was getting a little disillusioned with the work. And I left for about 5 years before coming back home to launch We the People. But part of the reason was that I think the predominant strategies that we were moving were prioritizing electoral mobilizing over power organizing. Now, what I mean by that is that when we are in an important place for shaping national elections, it means political donors, philanthropy, national organizations really give a shit about us every 2 or 4 years for at least 3 months, right before an election. Like they care. So what was ultimately ended up happening a lot, and this is where I contest a lot with some of our elected, that field and organizing are not the same thing. And I hate when that gets conflated. Field and particularly electoral field and organizing are not the same thing. And what we were seeing happen, from my perspective, is that an overemphasis on elections first or elections only, that is the most important arena of contestation, or the only arena of contestation that matters, is that it relegates our people to being bodies and numbers and data points in a voter file and treated as such. They're treated as individuals in a market, right? There's a political marketplace and they are consumers in that. And so we're vying for them as individuals. It's very, very different than organizing, which has to treat our people as human beings, as agents, as leaders, as people capable of collective action in a democracy. They're fundamentally different. And so for me, a lot of it was kind of the marketization of our politics, particularly in places like Michigan, that we're saying like we can micro target and extract as much data as possible. And so we're going to micro target this message to like white soccer moms in the suburbs who we think are really critical, persuadable, and fucking ignore working class Black and brown people until the very last minute and say, this is the most important election of your life again. Like I heard that shit the last 3, 4, 5 elections. Like some of these things that we were hearing. And so for me, that was the thing that we have to work really intentionally to break. The incentive structure is there, and in many cases, predominantly it's still the case. We still have communication firms out of DC spending $50 million in Michigan during an election, like things like this that are happening. That like, so part of it is saying like it's actually critical. Not only does that feel shitty as one of the people who grew up in a neighborhood like the ones that get targeted in this, like, oh, it's very clear we don't actually matter. You're using us. So why am I gonna take this seriously? But also it's deeply unstrategic because it's short term. It's not actually building any foundation. For me, it's tantamount to building sandcastles. And for far too long, we were building sandcastles. And sometimes they were big and beautiful and expensive, but they weren't ours and they were very easily washed away. And that was what was going on 10 years ago. For organizations like us, standing in solidarity with folks like SEIU, many of the other kind of organizing organizations that are accountable to a base, accountable to our people, to our members. For us, it has been saying like, it's actually incredibly important that we are focused on building power within our bases of people. For us, as we the people, it's like we also need to contest everywhere, including the places that Democratic Party operatives might be like, why the fuck would you have an organizer there? There's no chance of winning. That county don't matter. Only 12,000 people in that county. Why would you have? And for us, it's like we contest everywhere. We're not going to cede any place to the right. We're not going to allow some of the white nationalist organizing that's becoming more aggressive and explicit to take hold in some of our places. And we're going to contest it everywhere. So for us, it's saying sometimes that may mean for us in important elections. In 2018, we sat out the election cycle. We did a little bit of things here and there, but we said, look, if we just pivot to becoming a field mobilizing organization for this election cycle, we're going to burn the bridges and trust with the people that we are trying to build with to help understand like why the electoral avenue is a worthy avenue for us to contest in general. and that we're gonna focus first on like what matters to our folks. And if it's not the election, if it's like we need to actually fight on this particular issue in Kalamazoo County at that time, we need to kick the sheriff's ass to end the policy that he has of holding undocumented families for ICE. Cool, we'll focus on that. Or in Iron County, we need to get really serious about what they're doing with some of the addiction response, because they're just locking up a bunch of people who are addicts. Like, how are we actually contesting? So for us, it was seeing where our people were to begin building, and then building for that. That's long term. There's some things where we had to sacrifice. Like, it's not going to be strategic for us at the arc of where we're at to engage aggressively in the election at this time if it's going to sacrifice us building the leadership, the kind of slow build of our people to get there. And now what we're seeing is that paying off in droves. The one example from this past election cycle is because of what Jen was mentioning. We have fairer districts now, not perfect. There's a lot of ways in which there's still a lot of changes we need to make, but it made some fairer districts that were competitive, including in rural communities. Well, we've been in some of these rural communities, like people hadn't had organizers there in decades. And so we've been there building, showing up, working with folks. And in the 103rd, which is a rural district in Northwest Lower Peninsula, it's an agriculture heavy district. It's the heart of the cherry belt, one of the largest cherry producing regions in the country, that part of the region. We said we think it is possible for us to win, and win from the left, and win with a progressive there, win from the left. One of our organizers named Betsy Kafia threw her hat in, ran for the seat. And for us, a lot of things to unpack on that, so I'll be brief. But for us, what was really critical is that was an ingredient of getting Betsy over the finish line, is we've been driving a campaign to win back driver's license for undocumented people in the state of Michigan. And our farm worker base and committees in that region were very, very clear about their incumbent representative, who had chaired the transportation committee and blocked our bill twice, that he needed to go. And Betsy was going to be a champion. She publicly committed. She wasn't doing the like milquetoast Democrat thing of being like, I'm with you, I just can't really say it. She was like full throated. I'm with you. This is a priority for me. Let's go. And so we had folks who were building committees, doing political education in the migrant camps, in the trailer parks, doing all of this work in a community that is treated as invisible. Committees of undocumented farm workers covering shifts of eligible voters who were farm workers on the apple orchards during harvest, so they could leave and go register to vote and vote early for the fourth time. Another benefit of one of the ballot initiatives that Jen mentioned, so they could go and vote. And Betsy won by 700 votes. That is the seat that gave Democrats the trifecta that enabled things like right to work getting signed last night. So for us, it's saying like, it is incredibly important that we are contesting all over the place and building that with our people. Now, our people there, they didn't do that for Betsy. They didn't do that for Gretchen Whitmer. They didn't do that for the Democrats. For them, the election night wasn't the end. They did that because they have skin in the game and they need to win driver's license, because they're seeing far too many of their community members get pulled over, processed by ICE because they don't have a driver's license, then deported, and families getting ripped apart. So for them, it's like, okay, this is just one peak along the way. The election was not the end point. The election was one peak in a longer campaign. It is a tool to help reset the game board for a more favorable fight on the issue that our community cares about. So those are the types of interventions that for us, we think are really critical. And the last thing I'll say in 2 seconds is that we have to be clear and explicit about race and class in places like everywhere, particularly in places like, we're one of the most segregated places in the United States. And if we continue to allow places like Detroit, Flint, where I grew up, Pontiac, Benton Harbor, Muscatine, that are majority Black cities that have had multi-generational economic devastation, be pitted against other communities, rural communities that have also faced multiracial economic devastation. We're having communities in pain pitted against one another at the benefit of wealthy actors and right-wing political actors. And we cannot allow that to happen. So we have to contest that everywhere we can. Those two things, organizing over mobilizing, and we got to be real about race and class in the state of Michigan.
Can I just like add a little bit to what I would say is absolutely like for when I moved back to Michigan, like people would say Detroit and they actually mean Black people. And so I think for me, like my intervention as a white woman in that space is to say, do you mean Black people? Because you can say that. Like, let's just have that conversation. Is like to push back in those moments and like have that conversation. I also, your point, like Betsy Kofi at the 103, I think is a huge example also around infrastructure, right? Like the Democratic Party, the House Dems wrote that race off early on. You know, Betsy's openly pro-choice. She's talking about choice too much. She's pro-driver's license. She's talking about that too much. She's pro-worker. She's talking about that too much. She wasn't on the talking points. She wasn't moderating. She wasn't equivocating. She was running authentically as who she was on all fronts, not just driver's license. Like that is who Betsy is, right? And early on, the caucus like really wrote her off. And it took a lot of pushing in those inside spaces to change that. But it also like they saw what Betsy was doing, the results she was getting, the fundraising she was doing, the door knocking. She knocked more doors than I think there are two candidates in her tier of door knocking, let alone, I mean, head and shoulders above so many people. Like she actually did the work. And that worked her into that, and kind of the inside pressure from some of us who were in those like Democratic Party spaces, like got her into that priority space. And in the end, she was a priority for the caucus because they knew they could get it, right? Because of the work she did. And I think for me, she's a great example that I continue to use internally within like inside party infrastructure to say you can run authentically as who you are and share and like lead with your values, not hide from them. Right. And I think, you know, as we saw candidates up and down the state get beat up with some really racist, horrific, you know, they want to defund the police, they want open borders, just horrific like racist tropes being used against them, and them kind of milk toasting, not really just explicitly, like I think Betsy's is the wave of the future, and an example we have to continue to lift up of how we can win for our people in real authentic ways.
I want us to go further on this. This is really, really important, right? There's all of this talk about the white working class, and we need to quote unquote win the white working class back to the Democratic Party. And that often entails a politics of silence around race and dog whistle politics, or using a class only frame. So be really explicit about where does the white working class fit in your strategy, and how do they respond to these explicit messages?
I think to some of the so some of the points you've made are like race is weaponized, and like our opponents are using race to divide us, like they are. And so we have to be, I think, explicit about race to unify us, because the enemy isn't our Black or brown neighbor. The enemy is corporate power that wants to oppress all of us and like divide and conquer. And so for us, it's being really explicit about naming that. You know, just recently we had a you know, a group of members make some horrific comments about, you know, immigrants and things like that. So we had to have a like real like come to Jesus, like a moment where we come together and said, let's talk about this. What makes you feel that way? Where are you getting that message? Why do you think that that message is being delivered to you? Do you have more in common with these folks or with the developers who are pricing you out of Detroit? Like think, you know what I mean? So we have to have those conversations. It's not easy, but we've got to talk about it. And I think again, in Michigan, it goes back to that Midwest nice. We don't talk about hard things, but we just have to, you know, those in power are using race to divide us every day. And, you know, during this last election cycle, there were a ton of, especially in West Michigan, white mom groups that were coming together that were just really, you know, the programming and the messaging is just invasive in those communities. And so to Art's point, we have to contest that. We have to be in those spaces. But for me, the path to that is being as explicit about race as our opponents are. It is the only path, I think, to change that.
Yeah, completely agree. I think some of my analysis to this came. So you know, obviously, grew up in Flint in 2016. You know, I was the national training director at an organization called the Center for Popular Democracy. I was living in Boston. Yeah, I'd moved away for this period of about 5 years, and I came home during the water crisis. It's a longer story that I'm happy to share more about. But I think when I came home to organize around the water crisis, it was incredibly clear to me. It's a much longer story, tax and democracy, a whole thing. But Flint was politically expendable. Like they even after 8 months after they knew, 8 months after they fucking knew that the water had been tainted with lead, they didn't say anything. Flint was politically expendable. They didn't care. It's a poor city. It's a majority Black city. And so Flint was a place that could be kind of disregarded and was disposable. And I think for me, coming back home, organizing around that with people that I'd grown up with family, with folks that were kind of in the middle of all the shit that was going down during the Flint water crisis, it was very clear that we could have organized every person in the city of Flint. And we were aggressively organizing. But the levers of power that impacted those decisions existed outside the city of Flint. They're at the state. And we actually could not fight that alone. It was requisite if we were going to get some of the things that Flint needed, that we had to be building solidarity with other parts of the state in order to push the kind of the folks who were making power. And I think for me, the Flint water crisis is rooted in a crisis of power. And if we're going to be real about power, we got to be real explicit, and we got to be really, really clear about what that takes. And for me, I think it's not only the right thing to do, but I'm pretty nakedly and thinking, like, what is our pathway to victory? Because I've seen what it means for our people to lose and lose bad, and that means like my family has been in a position where like folks are getting sick, they're dying before they should, and they're facing indignity, and that's not okay. And so for me, it's like looking at the calculus in a state like Michigan, we need to be building toward majoritarian approaches via a working class fight lens. Michigan's over 70% white. You know, we're our largest city, the city of Detroit, which is our largest city by far, is 90+% people of color. It's about 80% Black. 8 Mile Road, which is the border of the city of Detroit, that's the starkest racial divide in the United States. Metropolitan Detroit is the most segregated region in the United States statistically. So when we have that, we are fertile ground for a divide and conquer politics. And so for me, when we're thinking about that, is like, quite frankly, as a kid who grew up as like a working class Mexican kid in Flint, I would love to just be building with like Black and brown folks who share the same experiences that I've had, but that's not real. We actually have to be building legitimately multiracial solidarity with working class people across the board if we want to seriously contest and win. So for me, it's like, one is about power, and two is actually, as Jen said very, very clearly, like the right is using a divide and conquer policy that is explicitly using race to divide our folks. And it's actually incumbent upon us to be making sure that we're bridging against that we're explicitly fighting against it. So for us, because we anchor a lot of rural community, we're doing explicitly white working class organizing in some of the communities that we're engaging in. And part of it is making sure that we are contesting, as Jen said, and making sure that folks actually see solidarity with others with whom they share material interests, to understand how we actually win the things that we need. That I think is really critical. There's not other pathways to meaningful victory in a place like Michigan without it.
That clarity is so important, and having that alternative approach and speaking about it and why it matters. I wonder if each of you could weigh in, started with Jennifer, on the particular role that unions play in building a multiracial democracy.
I will say we need to do, collectively, we need to do better. Is one thing I will say. I think within SEIU, our theory of change is very clear. We will never know economic justice until we know racial justice. They are inextricably linked. Our people will never be free until Black workers are free. Like, that's just the reality we live in. And you know, we have an incredibly diverse membership. You know, the local I worked for used to conduct calls, and still does, in 7 languages every Monday, right? They have a membership call in 7 languages. That is who we are. And so for us, you know, the fight for racial justice and centering it, we center it in all of our work, and to Art's point, that's how we collectively as working people win. What I will say is, you know, different unions are in different spaces. I think my role in the labor space is to continue pushing on that front, and to continue having those conversations with folks for whom it's uncomfortable. You know, race was not a conversation in my mom's union hall. Let me just say, it wasn't. You know, it's not something we talked about. But in as an adult and with my lens now, I know that they should have been, right? And so I think that we still collectively as a labor movement have a lot of work to do. And for me, I see that as one of my, roles within that space when I'm in those spaces, to really like push for that and to be an advocate for our people, because those are the workers, that I represent. And again, our theory of change is very clear. We will never know the economic justice our members and all workers deserve until we know racial justice.
Eric, could you weigh in on the role of unions and what you've seen worked or not work, or what you'd like to see more of?
Yeah, so look, I think for me, like, at SEIU, in Michigan, I think largely what Jen is saying, like that the clarity on that is for us is really important. It's the reason why kind of they're kind of one of our closest siblings, working with the set of organizations that are focused on long-term power building within the organization. But look, I think in Michigan, our unions are like play a critical role and are going to continue to play a critical role. And it's actually really important that there's some of the conversations, pushes, and also aggressive organizing pushes that are really clear, about the need to be building explicit kind of multiracial working class work. I think in a lot of ways, right? I'm sure the kind of classic debates that many folks in this call are familiar with between kind of social movement unionism and business unionism, on kind of where some of these fights are placed. And I think hopefully after kind of this big important right to work victory, we're going to see some of our siblings in the labor movement, organizing strategies, being really aggressive, on linking arms, with communities, with folks who don't yet have representation in the workplace. To say it's actually really important that we're pushing for power, and not just kind of what are the gains for our folks who are members currently right now. And the contract fights, all those things are really critical. Folks got to win at the bargaining table, and we can't afford to just win at the bargaining table. It actually really becomes important that we're advancing strategies together around how we're fighting for the things that all of our communities need. And I get really excited. Jen has been one of the people I think that we look to is really pushing inside of some of those rooms, and I think there's a lot more potential. Historically, Michigan was a place of social movement unionism, and I think we see it in a lot of different iterations, including kind of counter factions within labor that actually accelerated very important and deep in places like right here in Detroit, where I'm sitting right now, with things like the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, and seeing folks that were actually pushing really clearly with a clear radical lens on what was needed and what people deserved. And I think that tradition is here. It's part of our movement ancestry in this place. And the more that we get victories, the more we think about the terrain as abundant, as opposed to kind of a limited pie that we just gotta fight for the scraps and kind of contain what is ours. And I think the more that we're continue to enable the possibility for more victories, the more expansion we can think about, particularly as we lock arms with our siblings in the labor movement.
One of the things I really appreciate about both of you and this series is the depth of commitment, the length of time, right? Working at this, both in Michigan and beyond. And so there's a real sense of longevity tied to this, the current rhetoric of the battle for democracy, the rise of authoritarianism, the crisis that's on our doorstep, and the clarity around that we need to rewrite the rules long-term to really have this stick. And I think the right is very clear that that's what they're going for. That's why they ran people for Secretary of State all across the nation. They want to rewrite the rules from the ground up. So as you evolve and grow and deepen and strengthen these statewide multiracial coalitions, what's the relationship with the conventional Democratic Party? Are they helping? Are they hurting? Are they changing?
Oh, you want me to take this one first? So I think from my standpoint as kind of folks who've been kind of building grassroots organizing side, I think we have tended to play a little bit more of a kind of outside agitational role with the party. There's a lot of kind of strategic difference that we've had ultimately on kind of where investments make sense on some another. I think there's been a lot of progress. There's been a lot of progress more broadly, but I think like for us, the things that we see, and it can exist in particular pockets, right? Of like the folks who are overseeing campaigns within particular within House caucus and Senate caucus, whatever. But I think for me, like we're very clear that like our people need results, that we need bold values and vision, and folks who are out there actually doing that. It's why folks like, like I said, one of her last day on the job with We the People was the day before she got sworn into office with Betsy Kafia. Similarly, for one of our kind of most progressive member of the Detroit City Council right now, Gabby Santiago Romero, who was my previous policy director, who very similar on that. Like that we do need to be contestant, but it's really important that the lens that our elected officials have are ones that are accountable to working class people, that are in relationship with movements, that are moving on some of those things. And oftentimes the kind of advice or the ways in which they can get kind of teed up on the official side by political operatives and consultants who often dominate far too much of the strategy within the party, is the opposite. Is saying like it's fundamentally fear-based, right? It's saying like we actually can't afford you to be that bold. It's too risky. We can't piss off key donors. We don't want to piss off police. We don't want to piss off this corporation or that corporation. And actually what our people want is people who are willing to fight for you. Like our people want like folks who are willing to go out there. That's what we do as organizers every day. We're out there saying like, look, it's incredibly important that our people are fighting for the dignity that we deserve, and we deserve folks who are going to be pretty clear about what that looks like. And so it requires us to have some of our partners who are more positioned on the inside, as Jen was describing earlier, to be like, hey, y'all better not sleep on Betsy because like a lot of people were sleeping on Betsy, and like Betsy is now like the first legitimate progressive organizer to be representing a rural state or a rural district in Michigan in generations, right? Like it is a really important thing. And so it's also very, very different when we have a person like Betsy in the most marginal seat who's very clear on values, who's very clear on where she's coming in from, as the kind of like inverse Joe Manchin, if you will, right? That like if our most marginal person is somebody that like won and ran from the left, rooted in values, is strong on issues, is bold, know who she is going to stand up and fight, is going to be who she is out in the world then that means that there's a pressure on leadership, on the party to actually then go with that. So I think for me, there's still good and healthy tensions there. I think at the end of the day, it's really, really important that movements are constantly pushing parties. I mean, to get a little bit on the nerdy side, of book recommendation on this, Daniel Schlotzman wrote a book recently, last a handful of years, called "When Movements Anchor Parties." That it's fairly academic, but I think it's really thoughtful, a historical look at kind of the influence of social movements within political parties. That I think is an important one to read and be thinking about. We're really clear. Our role as an organization like We the People is to push, and we're aggressive, and we're gonna keep on pushing, mostly from the outside.
I would say we push from the inside and the outside. I would say, like, I feel as though, to Art's contrast between mobilizing and organizing, the Democratic Party has a role in mobilizing, right? That is a lane that they can occupy. And what I would say is, we, for example, have shifted our investments as an organization into base building, like power building organizations, like the ones Art mentioned, as opposed to the party, because we believe that's the path to long-term power, right? But I will also say there is a role to Art's point of being in the inside and pushing and pushing and pushing for them to invest in races like Betsy's or, Joey Andrews on the West Coast of the state. Another example of someone who ran with his values came from the Michigan AFL-CIO, and so, and to push in those spaces. So, I think it is important to push on the inside. But for us, it's also dramatically expanding our outside game. We have challenges with the Democratic majority every day, right? And so, it is a constant push. And generally that push is for them to think bigger and out of boxes that they've kept themselves in. And to, that's the way it's always been, is not an excuse to keep it that way, right? And so I think it's important to continue pushing. But I think it's also, to Art's point, is to build a longer term power, like that's actually about organizing and unleashing the power of our people, and not depending on kind of a any one statewide entity. So again, for us, I think it's an inside outside game. So yeah.
Great, thank you for that. Well, let's turn now to the future. What are some of the opportunities that really enable progressive forces to bolster and deepen democracy?
There's tons and tons of opportunity. I think that I see here. I think right now, a lot of even the Victory and Right to Work is focused on kind of undoing some of the structural kind of regressive policies that the Republicans, who were incredibly thoughtful and savvy, not just about what are these weren't actually like what are our kind of red meat to our base issues. They weren't. These were like, what are structural things that actually inhibit the power of their opposition? That's right to work. Right to work, that was not a thing in Michigan that was like red meat to base, Republican Party base members, average voter clamoring for right to, that wasn't that. This was about attacking the power of organized labor. Similar things that they did in a number of other things, preemption being one of them that we gotta attack. Like right now, we can't do things like local wage board or a living wage ordinance or rent control in a city. We can't do any of that. It's all preempted by the state. So that again was a big push that that Republicans did over those last. There's a number of structural things that I think like there's going to be some of those things that we have to be able to work through and undo. But for me, there's kind of two thoughts that I have on this. One is that the pendulum is going to this isn't like it's going to be like, okay, we're just going to kind of hold on to this kind of Democratic majority that we have right now, trifecta, like in perpetuity. The pendulum will swing on some of this. For us, it's about, are we seeding enough powerful organizing in enough places that when we are kind of having these moments of taking power, that we have our moment over the next decade of an actual big, bold, transformative agenda. And that does become possible for us if we are clear and intentional, thoughtful about inside game, outside game, and moving some of this in very real ways. Now, I want to give the counter example to that. That to me is a thing that it's seared into my mind, is March 16th, 2011. This is when Republicans had gotten their trifecta. March 25th, so this was what would have already been signed in this. That is when Governor Snyder signed the emergency management law. Now, the emergency management law was deeply unpopular. The emergency management law, for those who aren't familiar, what it did is it gave the authority to the governor to say if a community is deemed to be in financial distress, the governor can appoint an emergency manager who has unilateral authority over a municipality or a school board. It nullifies the rights of the rights of locally elected mayors, city councils, school boards, gives unilateral authority to somebody who has the sweeping powers to eliminate contracts, to dissolve contracts, to do fundamental changes. So this was something that the Republicans had been focused on. It was a policy written by the Mackinac Policy Center, which is a right-wing free market think tank that has an incredible amount of corporate support, who wrote this policy. This was also about extracting as much as possible from majority Black cities, places like Detroit, Benton Harbor, Flint, Pontiac, places like Muskegon Heights, who basically had a bunch of their public assets sold off, a tax on pensions, pensioners stripped, all kinds of things that were happening because of it, because that were enabled by this. And again, deeply unpopular. This was deeply unpopular. There was regular protests leading up to this conversation, largely by AFSCME, because AFSCME knew what this would mean for some of their contracts and some of their retirees that were moving. And Republicans said, like, this is what's important for who we look to for governing power, which is a set of corporate conservative actors. This is what needs to get done, and so we're gonna make sure that this gets done. And they passed the emergency management law, despite massive protests. It was unpopular enough that the next year we actually repealed it at the ballot box. We repealed it. It was a one progressive victory that we had in 2012. We repealed it, which is amazing. All this, like, we just repealed this unjust, undemocratic law. But because they were so entrenched and had governing power, they just, during the lame duck period of the legislative session that year, it was just less than 40 days later, they just tweaked the law, added a $30,000 appropriation to make it referendum proof so that people could not repeal it, and repassed it to keep the emergency management regime in place. So this was extreme, right? It was like a majority of Black folks in the state of Michigan were living in communities where their locally elected officials were stripped of their ability to govern. We had the Flint water crisis never happened without the emergency management system in place. So the reason I lift all of these things is because what we had was the right moving very clearly on organizing power in the decision-making arena, the first face of power fight. They were very, very clear about that. Their second face of power, the agenda setters, were incredibly clear and aligned and putting pressure on decision makers in very real and clear ways and mobilizing all of their resources. And the third face of power, they were shifting the Overton window on this issue. And the Overton window, for any other kind of political nerds out there, the Overton window was like, how do we shift public perception or the palatability of a particular issue from it being seen as radical or extreme to being seen as possible or popular, is coined after John Overton, who is the senior vice president of the Mackinac Policy Center here in Michigan, who died in a plane crash in the early 2000s. That's who the term is named after, John Overton. They were deliberately moving these strategies to say, how do we take something that is as extreme as saying, if your community is in financial distress, we will appoint someone who has unilateral authority, to make all like that. So what the point that I'm trying to make is, like, that's governing power is what they had. It's inverse to our values. It's concentrated within a set of corporate and wealthy elite, but that is governing power, of them being able to move a big, bold, destructive, but transformative agenda as soon as they took power. We ain't there yet. We got some work to do. But if we're actually staying steady on the pathway that we're on, building the nodes of power that we need to be building, where we're building them, it is possible for us to build toward a multiracial working class governing power, to have our moment where a transformative agenda is possible when the pendulum swings our way again, as we're going to contest continually over these next decades. That's what we're preparing for those moments.
I would just like for me, the next 10 years, we have to tell those stories in full context, right? Emergency management that happened in 2010, between 1980 and 2010, local communities got 40% fewer resources from the state government. So they created a problem where cities were in financial distress because they quit giving them resources they needed to do the business of our daily lives in local governments. And then they took over, right? That was not an accident. They created a problem, offered a solution, right? And we have to name that, right? And then similarly, you talked about preemption, like, when we tell the preemption story, we have to unify rural and urban communities and say, look, this is a really explicit attack on Black communities, to the thinking being that white folks in Lansing know better. And it's an attack on rural communities because, again, the perception is that folks in Lansing know better than these, uneducated rural communities, right? It is an attack on local control. It is an attack on our democracy. And so we have to talk about preemption in that context. I think always, how do we bolster and deepen democracy? Like, for me, it is, again, investment in that, like, cross-racial working class solidarity and having complicated conversations, doing genuine organizing and investing in that in the long term, and understanding there will be bumps along the road. You know, to Art's point, Michigan is a swing state. There will be bumps in the next 10 years. We are not going to know all sunny days. I mean, I hope we do, but realistically, we understand that's not. So how do we prepare our people for those times and to use those as moments to spring into the next, right? And so I think that there's so much hope and so much possibility in Michigan. And I love Art's example of, you know, we need to stop building incredibly beautiful sandcastles and start building like the houses and the permanent infrastructure our people need to build that power over time. Love a sandcastle, but we've got to build something permanent that our folks need. And so tons of opportunity to deepen our democracy, especially with the laws we've recently passed. And again, with the Secretary of State, who I can't, she's kind of one of us. She is one of our comrades, and she is a fierce defender of democracy. And we're so fortunate to have her.
I think that's a wonderful note to end this portion on. Thank you both for your incredible commitment, passion, wisdom, and insights, and sharing it with us. This last topic deeply resonates for us as New Yorkers because we underwent emergency management. I don't know if we started it actually in the 70s, right? In the crisis in the 70s, it was resolved with an emergency management board. So it's quite intriguing, if not appalling, to see it being weaponized, right, as a tool across the country to roll back democracy. Thank you so much. We're going to end our recording of this session here and turn to our next segment.